All right, let me move around so I don't feel like this is outstaging me, this podium. All right. Today I'm going to be, talking about hope, which is really weird, right? Because when you speak about hope today, it seems like you're speaking about something really controversial. And, so when I wrote this book, because the previous book, The Next Billion Users, was published in 2019, and it was basically written for development agencies. I've been working with UN and many of these development agencies for about 2 decades, and I still sit on many of their boards. And I realize there's a sort of double standard to the majority world and, the West and the rest, so to speak, right? So when it comes to digital, we have these discourses which allow for full freedoms and engagements, and we really pay attention to how people, build meaning with digital tools in Western context. But when it comes to the global South, it's looked at in deeply instrumental terms, are they like mobilizing and leapfrogging to learn English and healthcare and, all these so finally they can have socioeconomic mobility. That's the narrative, right? And so I basically wrote The Next Billion Users calling them on that, right? And saying that we really need to treat them. Guess what? The biggest insiders, kids in, say, kids in Lisbon or Boston are similar to kids in Kerala or, Nigeria. And that's radical because if you treat them in a way that they're typical teens who are driven by, the same kind of drives that a typical teen has, which is they want to engage, socialize, and get entertained. They want intimacy. They're trying to self-actualize. They're trying to figure themselves out, and they're trying to answer this big question: am I a freak? Right? So, and sexuality and sex is so fundamental to who they are and what they are to become. And by saying that, I remember, and I pushed for the leisure discourse, let's bring leisure into the digital leisure practices, because within that, we can understand how they exercise their freedoms, how do they build, maybe future job opportunities. All that will come, but let's start from a full-fledged approach. What was fascinating was that at the same time when I released The Next Billion Users book, every major tech company started rolling out their red carpets, inviting me to cut ribbons, and it was like, what's going on? Because literally, when the book came out, every big tech company came up with their next billion user group. Spotify, Adobe, Google, we're talking about, say, 15 people at Google went to 600 in a month. And guess why, right? It's a data-based economy, and there's an AI race, and whoever has the most data wins. So we have some concrete facts. 90% of young people, live outside the West, and 85% of the world's population are in the global South. So these are just numbers that are producing data, right? And so on top of it, basically in the last decade, a lot has changed. The global South is not what it used to be. I mean, they went from having some of the most expensive internet in the world to some of the cheapest. Look at the top countries with the cheapest mobile internet. They are in India, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Nigeria, the list goes on, right? And they're on it twice the amount of time. They not just are online, but they're twice as intense in their usage. And the part of it is because, they are able to self-actualize relative to what the existing realities are. And so anyway, long story short, and I will go into that, but after starting to engage with industries, I started to get a lot of insight because I was getting into territory, right? Speaking to all this big tech from within. It was like getting into the belly of the beast, right? And then I realized I could be a Trojan horse. I mean, I'm a digital anthropologist, for God's sake. It's like, what am I doing there? And so now I'm user experience, So that's the new thing, old thing in industry speak. But, or futurist, which is another bullshit term you'll see on LinkedIn, right? But basically, you enter these organizations, and then you start to realize that there are a lot of good people and bad systems too. And they're well-meaning and they want to do the right thing, but internally they still think in segmented terms, much like academia, by the way. You have an equity product team and an international team. as if it's something separate. And then there's the rest of the teams, cloud computing, marketing, etc. Guess what? In academia, whenever I talk about the global south, they think of, it's still relegated to development studies, right? It's very heavily, only in the last few years, it's become, massaged into different disciplines. It's not on the side. And I think that's really fascinating. It's like you have to make a case. When you see an article which says, youth engagements and discourses with, say Instagram in Boston or in the anything in the US, right? That doesn't exist. That's the norm. That's like the neutral. When people say human-generated AI, what do they mean by human? Is default, like Western, middle class, male, white. That's usually that. If you say culture, people are like, oh, we've got to respect culture. It's a proxy for traditional, the rest of the world. So anyways, this is why I wrote this book. But what is very interesting is, despite people like, oh, but you're feeding into the extractor machine, the data colonial machine, etc., I was like, well, if it's not us, who else, right? We academics need to be in the room to shift people's mindsets, because it's a privilege, right? And this is the principal message about the book, is it's really a privilege to, be in a mindset of despair, because the rest of the world are deeply optimistic because they see the digital tools, including AI, as a very powerful force that they can recalibrate their futures. And so this is, so basically in academia, right, I wrote this book again because of discourse, and this is very much why we are here, and how discourses can impact the way in which we think and the way in which we build things, policies, technologies, and contribute to those processes, right? And what we're witnessing now is a sort of like a optimism-pessimism divide, right? The West is becoming more and more pessimistic by nature and about all things tech, the future, the digital, because guess what? It's sort of like doubled down, and mainstream media sort of like massaged it into it, where AI is going to, say, destroy our planet, a lot of like will replace our jobs, and academia is backing it, right? So basically AI is replacing our jobs, it's existential crisis, it is also destroying our mental health, etc. And academia also is like, I love we've been on his, actually I was on his book panel to launch, and he, what I like is he's one of the few scholars who takes critique without getting personal. And so we both have fundamentally different positions. He calls himself a pessimist, he's like, I'm a techno-pessimist, there's no hope. I remember the audience member saying, you've been trying to do alternative platforms for all these years, decades, so where do we go? He's like, there's no hope, it's been a waste of time. I'm like, dude, do we not have enough depressing narratives, Anyway, but the thing is, people are committed to the idea that, well, this is the discourse we are heading to, because we have formidable forces, we have big tech that is crushing our very society, and you feel like crippled to a point of impotence, right? And, one after the other, books after books are being written about it, which is basically, we are intrinsically oppressed by design, right? It's baked into the system, which feels like, what's the point then? In fact, I've been teaching these courses on gender tech and visuality, and in the last few months at Utrecht, and I do these sort of polls with my students, and now 9 out of 10 say they don't want to have a seat at the table. In fact, they just want to blow up the system. They want to opt out of tech. I'm like, okay, with your mobile phones, your smartwatches, you just use Google to come here at this new menu, so sure, opt out. And this is ideological, right? It's ideological, and it's driving, so they come up with questions like, in what ways are these asylum seekers oppressed by the system? It's not exploratory. And so this is generating a sort of, and reifying these narratives through the way in which you ask these questions based on your starting points, right? And so, it's basically, of course, these sort of, questions of, are they racist, sexist, and the way in which they're like, no, we critique. That's the other thing that I get time and again. Of course, we are critical, and it doesn't mean that if you're critical, you're pessimistic. I'm like, actually, it depends on how you're critical, right? Because if you say agency is basically only through resistance, that means you're positioning AI against humanity, right? Because your way of exercising agency is by, disowning it. So the kinds of questions driving is that, how do I contain AI, control it, put it in its place? You're not seeing it as an extension of a critical tool that can enable, and reduce certain tediousness, or create new forms of intimacy with different people, to self-actualize. And I'll give you a lot of examples, particularly from the Global South. And of course, I'm heading actually end of this week to have a debate with Hyde's group in Doha on very much this, because he's very influential in actually getting policy based on the fact that he thinks mobile phones and social media are devastating and creating an anxious generation. And if you're not doing something about it right now, as of yesterday at least, then you are irresponsible parents, policymakers, and social actors in general. And so, this is again a very privileged perspective, because it's driven from, these sort of interesting ways in which you read these reports. For example, remember Hayden, who came up with the whistleblower about, how Instagram was feeding into the depression of teenagers. In the same report, it said twice the number of teens. It found these spaces as spaces also of solidarity, because they were very isolated, partly because they are living in authoritarian regimes, and they felt there was ways in which they could connect with people like them across the world, partly because they're struggling with just regular teen issues, which they can't talk about because majority of the countries are super conservative. There's social norms, particularly gender norms. You can't talk about sex and sexuality, in most countries. 137 countries criminalize homosexuality to a point of death, right? In Uganda and many Middle East countries, South Asian countries don't even recognize it. It's not even in that agenda because it's a Western disease, right? That's still happening. And also picture, telling Afghanistani girls and women who now cannot go to school, can't be in public spaces, it can't actually stand next to a window because they may create shame and dishonor towards their family. That's a Taliban policy. Imagine trying to tell them, hey, why are you being online and feeling good about it? Don't you know you're being extracted by the corporate machine? It's always relative to what? What is your context? We need to become more, build in nuance again for us to start rethinking about what these mean, right? And so, it's interesting, the economists basically already signaled what's happening. It's like, where the Americans are becoming more and more, depressed. And in fact, the average American today says they're far more pessimistic about the future and tech, and this is before Trump, right, than a decade ago, despite the fact that they're still one of the most richest, powerful, and relatively speaking, still have a liberal democracy, whatever, as we see it dismantling. But this was then, right? And in the meantime, we have the Global South reporting, very optimistic oriented, future. So 9 in 10 people in Kenya, Mexico, China, India are optimistic about the futures, unlike those in the global north, right? Including about how AI has impacted the workplace, again, the same pattern persists. And I'll give you an instance, like my cousin sister's in India, and she's got this sort of small, video, audio-visual video sort of consultancy. So they basically produce content for companies in Australia, US, the UK, and she said yes, she's afraid of AI, and so is her team, but it has become so fundamental to her business model. She's already pivoted again. Why? Because it took them extraordinary amount of time, energy, and also money to get the accent right. She said, it's also not just the accent, it's like we basically have to speak in British terms. Like, there's a lingo, and or Australian terms, and you have to repurpose, which takes a lot of energy, and we couldn't focus so much on content. Now we use AI immediately to take care of those aspects, and we can focus on the message, the way in which we can deliver quality content, and it has been very liberating in many ways. And yes, they're still fear-driven, but they're also moving ahead. They don't have the privilege to pause and reflect. They have to either do it now or they may die as an industry, because the global south is at the forefront of how work is being calibrated, and if they don't repurpose immediately, then they will really be replaced, right? And then again, optimism with climate crisis, which again is really interesting, because if you see and immerse, and many of you already are, about the climate justice conversations, the global south are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. In fact, data centers are directly competing with critical resources of water and land in many of the communities in the global south. So of course they're at the forefront. So what's going on? Why are they optimistic about it, for God's sake, right? And what is the narrative is a couple of things. One, they're naive, these global south people, they don't know yet what's at stake. So what we need to do as a development agency, a think tank, a philanthropy organization, a government, is to build more literacy programs. Let me teach them how they are and why they should be depressed, and then they become as pessimistic as us. That's one narrative. Second narrative could be that, well, they're not there yet, right? I mean, the whole digital divide and all. So if only once they catch up with us, then they're going to get depressed, right? Well, not quite, because, if you want to see where the fintech is, who are the top in fintech, it's not the US and it's not Europe. It's a lot of East Asia. In fact, they are like a decade ahead. I mean, the US is still writing checks, right? So it's all, if you think about what Elon Musk is telling the world, I mean, besides a lot of other bullshit, is that, he's saying that he wants X to be a WeChat, which is old news, from a decade ago. It's like the Chinese, how is that a future vision? Is you want to be our past, right? I mean, and then you see even Elon Musk laughing a couple of years ago when they asked him, what do you think about BYD, the car, right? And he's like, have you seen their car? And they're like, do you not take it as serious competition? He's like, are you kidding me? It's like a shitty Chinese car. And today he's begging Europe to create blockades, because he's like, if you don't do this, the entire auto industry will be dead in Europe, because the BYD is that good. So luckily the internet has some memory, but that's basically where we at. And I get I was reached out, I mean, Amazon, certain groups reached out to me in recent months saying they really want to develop e-commerce and live streaming, and they really think it would be really cool to put live streaming. And I was like, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry in East Asia, right? It's so established, and you're thinking of doing that, right? That's my point. It's the global south is just not what it used to be. And the whole digital divide discourse, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying it's a much more complicated narrative. Of course, there are people who are not connected. Of course, it's not a denying that reality, but there's a much more nuanced reality which we need to reconsider, right? So if that's the case, right, how do we proceed? So a couple of ways. One is we need to really purge this digital divide. One is, of course, is that, this idea of linearity is there's a particular vision that you have to get to where the West is, but the West is not necessarily at the top. We have to recognize that. In some regards, it's just not. And also in terms of look at DeepSeek. Every time something new happens, Jesus, I can't believe, that took us by surprise. And DeepSeek is a public, it's public source. And what was interesting is that it sees diversity as an asset. Particularly in today's times where, literally in the New York Times, which share the different words that are discouraged in the US, including youth inclusion, diversity, gender, vulnerable, I don't know. Basically, I related to almost 90% of the words. I think I'm pretty much canceled. In fact, I did my US book tour at the heat of it, including at Columbia University. and every single organizer asked me if I felt comfortable talking about inclusion and if I wanted to sit it out for my reputation or sake. And I was like, this is completely nuts what's going on. Even last month, right? So, I mean, what's the optimistic take? Is this is the best thing that is happening in the US is it brings the rest of the world, I hope, together, because that will help us to really understand that we can really together as a majority world, circumvent the old guard finally and rethink what public digital infrastructures are, for example. So another interesting thing is I sit on the Indian Digital Economy Board, and they have built something which Europe has been trying to do for decades, which is a digital public infrastructure. So they call it the India Stack, which is basically open source and allows any entrepreneur to build their digital apps for free, right, using these public infrastructures. And you can be an entrepreneur from any part of the world in different dialects and languages, right? And that's really a game changer. There are also many countries in the global south that are building their small language models and dialects and languages which are shifting inclusion in education, healthcare. It's a radical measure, and we can't, we need to really wrap our mind around it, how radical that is. Because for the longest time, it was just impossible to have textbooks in multiple languages. And you talk about countries which have, due to the whole English imperialism for decades on the internet, that has shifted because of the next billion users coming online. Because they are speaking in these different languages, they're building their language sets in their, in their dialects and languages of their own region. And that is actually diversifying the internet at a faster rate than it ever has before, right? So we do need to stop thinking about the deficiency model as like, what are they missing? They lack literacy, education, etc., etc. The whole poverty porn narrative as one of the singular, most compelling narratives, and move for, more about enabling models. What is happening out there? And what's really interesting, by the way, about the India Stack is that the Europeans are working closely with the Indians to build the Euro Stack as a counter pressure to the big tech. And so we need to look at these new geopolitics and ecosystems based on these discourses, and how when you shift discourses, you have different kinds of collaborations, different kind of ecosystems and action-oriented processes. So I already brought up about the next billion users, and I just want to shift to, how that actually materialized. So, when I came up with the book, UNHCR reached out to me because I really critiqued them in a big way, and they said, all right, we'll build our annual work plan around your book, and let's start from the point that these are, what a lot of young people do is digital leisure-oriented work, and let's see what they're doing. It's not about how they get online, it's the whole connectivity issue, it's what they're doing when they go online, right? And we found that there's a lot of really interesting insights. We were looking at Venezuelan refugees in Brazil for over 2 years, and they were very, creative in the way in which they were using these digital tools, and they desperately wanted to opt in, not opt out. And not because they don't understand the risks and harms, of course they do. They actually, they understand authoritarianism. I mean, there's a reason why they were refugees. They understand surveillance. But they also understand that they are completely dehumanizing these refugee settlements, and they want to rehumanize. And one of the fundamental ways in which to not be forgotten and to think about how they can build connectivity with their culture, with their people, but also to come up with their own kinds of future jobs is by being online. So there was people who've come up, young people who've come up with eyebrow tutorials and are monetizing their videos to, self-help YouTube channels about their health issues or their journey. And there was all these other amazing activities which we reported and documented in this report, and which showed basically is that these were driving forces, which explains why they were so enthusiastic about digital tools despite the risks and harms, right? The other in my book I write about is how we need to think about also algorithms of aspirations and not just of oppression, because I start going to a point of refusal that it is deterministic and baked into the system, because all technologies are in the becoming. And if the quality of the data sets basically which goes into the training of AI are corrupt and are biased, then you can do something about it by rethinking what these golden data sets are, and industry speak. And we are doing very much that. So I'm working right now with Adobe, with my team in India, Ecuador, Kenya, and we are working with multiple collectives and digital creatives to actually create new content and populate and diversify the Creative Commons. And in this way, we get to have people from these different local contexts, show how they want to be represented. And we also have workshops on how they want to be labeled. And it's not just in languages and dialects, but the way in which they speak, the kinds of meaningful vocabulary. And that is shifting the way in which we can build data sets, because otherwise it's garbage in and it's garbage out. So you have enormous power, and there's power in numbers, right? And the Global South has that. So we are mobilizing that, and we're also trying to put it in every classroom so we can do an economy of scale, of action, right? And here is one of the multiple examples. Like, this is Neil Renaud. They are a fashion influencer from a tier 3 town in India, and they basically use the materials at their disposal to, connect and speak to their audience and respond to global trends. And what's really interesting is that they have a bigger following than most fashion brands in the world today, right? And this is why they are hopeful and people like them, because, even within, so I keep getting, I keep doing these little consultancy gigs for venture capitalists or, tech companies in these East Asia to India. And one of the interesting remarks, including those in India, said, I had no idea, when I read your book, I had no idea that outside the cities, there were people like them. I never think about them. That's the majority of India, right? So it's not about the North and the South. Internally, whether it's India, China, Nigeria, they don't think outside of, say, Mumbai or, the usual Lagos or any of the Cape Town, whatnot. They just focus on the cities, which barely hold, many people compared to the rest of their country. So there's already a divide within, right? And which is very colonial in its history and undertaking, and even before, through a caste system, and we don't need to go into that. But the point is that there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done. And so that's really interesting, because, a lot of them say that they basically are, leapfrogging these sort of social norms and, stereotypes, and speak to a global audience because they're less judgmental, right? So they get a global audience and fan following from everywhere in the world because they become a global citizen. And in fact, BBC does these polls every year, and they consistently show that the Global South, the average was 60 to 75% of young people in the Global South see themselves as global citizens, even if they'll never leave their village, their town, ever. Whereas the average, less than 30%, for example, in Germany or Italy or France, see themselves as global citizens. And in recent years, forget even European, right? And so that explains how they also reach out. If you look at the discourse around Dutch AI models, the most recent is there's 75 references of building a Dutch large language model for the Dutch, by the Dutch. And I'm like, when did the Netherlands become this, right? Inward looking and protectionist, and it's not even fortress Europe, it's fortress Netherlands. And so this doesn't help them to counter big tech, and so we have a sort of a opportunity here, which we cannot actually miss based on these sort of localized politics, right? It's here's another very important reason why people are driven to being online is romance economy. The 98% of young people in the Global South are going to have an arranged marriage, and that is a fact. And this will continue because culture is very sticky. But they want experience. They want to feel like they had a boyfriend or girlfriend, and they want to feel like they understand what intimacy is, and love, and sex, and sexuality. So many of them in my field research over 2 decades have had online girlfriends and boyfriends with people from all over the world, and they use Google Translate to chat with each other. So you have a lot of Indian boys and in tier 3 town having Brazilian girlfriends, and it's fascinating what's happening, and it's huge driver why they get online and stay online, right? So this is just one of the number of also ways in which they're creating like content to serenade the other, and as you can see, very global in the way they engage with, of course, Justin Bieber and whatnot. Anyway, it clearly works on somebody. So anyway, and then the surveillance of care, right, is another that I posit is that we need to think in terms of surveillance of care, not just on surveillance capitalism. And it made me pause when my students in recent years really struggled to fit their data into this theory. They're like, the participants are very enthusiastic about these tools, and they really are not just enthusiastic, they love them. And they love these spaces, and they understand the risk, but it doesn't kind of fit into the surveillance capitalism. And in fact, they want to be monetized, as I meant, in many ways, because it's like they see data as currency, as a way for them to pioneer new forms of work, because they refuse to be a farmer, they refuse to be a, plumber, or they don't want to do what their parents and grandparents did. They want to break out of that chain, and the governments, the markets are consistently failing them. So, it's not a coincidence that, and not to forget, you look at, from Venezuela to Lebanon, their economies are crumbling, their life savings are crumbling. So is it such a surprise where you have enormous number of influencers come and speaking about crypto and, why the Global South is leading that, like Argentina, Venezuela, because they have to. Otherwise, everything their parents and grandparents have, done is, basically pointless. So in that sense, that they are very determined to use the digital to actually move ahead. So surveillance care is more like, you're not watching each other, you're watching over each other, which is just as important an understanding and a framework for us to approach these technologies and people who use these technologies, right? So this is some of the examples where Iranian women are using AI-generated images, and we have a number of examples from our lab about whether it's Hong Kong and all. Actually, majority of countries don't have liberal democracies, less than 13% of the countries. So, to exercise your freedoms, you need to think out of the box, particularly if you want to be, a responsible activist, because activism is not a one-off. It's basically a way of life. It goes on for generations, because these are persistent systems, that they live with right now. So this is just a form of like AI-generated images by women activists who are really not putting actual people at harm's way, but are very clearly getting the message out that they have the right to wear what they want to wear and be and do what they want to do in public space. It's a reclaiming of public space, right? Or like from FemLab, we've been doing this work with feminist gig economy taxi companies, She Taxi and the like, and women workers are very enthusiastic about the gig economy, and they recognize there are a lot of issues with the gig economy, but for them it recalibrates, makes them professionalized. People start investing in them. They actually are allowed a mobile phone for professional purposes. So for them, their realities it is more enabling compared to what was existing before that. So we have to recognize that it's always in comparison to what and which are their lived realities, right? So to conclude, and I'm not sure how the time is, but I'm looking at Tom. So yeah, we're good. So because of course we can go into questions. I haven't looked at my time, but the point is, it's kind of interesting. We are at the stage where people are now calling me this, that optimist, like it's almost like a dirty word, and you're like, oh my God, you're an optimist in academia, you must be less critical. Actually, my first book talk was at University of Cambridge, where a number of well-meaning Global South women, because only Global South women can contest Global South women, apparently, said, you seem very naive about the realities of the Indian fascist state for you to be working with them. I'm like, you sitting out here, in Cambridge, trying to talk about blowing up the system because they call themselves academic anarchists. Sure, but if you actually engage with the state, do you know how big the state is? It's basically like a country. It's so heavy that if you scratch the surface, you will find enormous number of amazing people doing really good work. Because in the end of the day, all organizations, all states are made of people. And to write entire countries, institutions, organizations off because of their labels is to basically, flatten these entire cultures, which, by the way, will become a very, very lonely place because you will have almost nobody to engage with, So we have to see people and systems as separate. And I actually think that because I know when I get into these systems that there are people who want to do it right, and if it's not academics we do this for a living, we think for a living, we put all our energies into coming up with ways, and we don't have skin in the game. That's the most important thing. We don't have skin in the game, so which means we should actually be public oriented and guide well-meaning people who want to do it right, want to get on the right side, as in clear pathways, but also allow them, and work with them. Don't preach to them, right? So my point is, let's break out of this pessimism bubble, not by saying that critique is not important, but the way in which we critique should be constructive, should be action-oriented, and should not be elitist, where we believe that if you are not out in the streets and protesting, then what's wrong with you? Or, what's wrong with you for not using this kind of vocabulary? Maybe this vocabulary will get people flagged, and that's why they don't use it. But they're doing work which is very much meaningful, and it is slow and quiet activism. It's slow and quiet resistance. It's slow and quiet passion and love, because a lot of them are in love with technology, whereas we all have fallen out of love with it. And so I think that is, again, a very privileged perspective, because we have genuine alternatives of communities, of institutions, and of practices. So, if we can do that, and because we have some of the most formidable problems we face today, which are global in nature, whether it is, democracy, and the rebuilding of it, and also nurturing it, because it clearly is a system that is in need of constant nurturing, right? And in terms of, the climate crisis, where we need everyone on board, because without that, we cannot move ahead in resolving some of these chronic issues. And so once we pop the pessimism bubble, I think we can really take leadership, particularly if you're from the humanities, because some of the biggest questions we are asking today are: what is trust? What is creativity? What is engagement with these ideas online? Is the kinds of discourses. A lot of it is, driven by the humanities. And I think we should be not just at the table, we should be leaders for meaningful change. So, thank you.